Hello everyone. In this lesson we will continue to write highly organized CSS. To be more specific, we will complete the text styles for the large hero block, and we will also begin and complete the button styles that are used throughout the design. This should be a lot of fun. Let's get started. Alright, to begin, let's make sure that we have our index.html file open within a web browser. To do that, you just navigate to the project folder, drill into the app folder, and then drag index.html on top of the browser. Alright, let's write some CSS. Let's jump over to our text editor, and let's open up the CSS file that's dedicated to the large hero block. So that file lives in the app folder, and then the assets folder, the styles folder, and then the modules folder. There it is, large hero. So the first thing that I want to do is to eliminate this spacing or margin between the different text elements. So let's completely remove that margin. So on this title element, let's just say margin 0. Let's copy and paste that to the subtitle element as well. Go ahead and save this. That looks better. Let's compare what we have to the design file. So I think the next thing we should work on is making this text white and using a larger font size than what we currently have. So let's go ahead and locate this element in our HTML file. Our index.html file lives in the root of the app folder. Let's find the large hero block. Here it is. So here is the element in question. Let's go ahead and give it a BEM class. So this element belongs to the large hero block. To indicate that this is an element of that block, we use 2 underscores. And now we can come up with any name we want for this element. Let's go with description. Let's save this and jump over to our largehero.css file. And underneath the subtitle rule, let's just create a brand new rule. Let's begin the selector with the ampersand. Because we are nested within the main large hero block rule, the ampersand will actually be converted to large hero. So let's begin with ampersand underscore underscore description. And if you remember, we want to make the text white and use a larger font size. So let's say color should be FFF for white. And let's bump up the font size to maybe 1.5 rem. Let's see how that looks. It doesn't look terrible, but it doesn't look quite right either. I think we need to fine-tune the font size a bit, which is the perfect segue into talking about rem. In this course, whenever we declare a font size or a padding or margin value, we want to do so in terms of rem instead of pixels or percentages or EM. We want to use rem. So the question is, what in the world is rem? When we use rem, everything is relative to the root of the page. And the root of any web page is always the HTML element. So when we say 1.5 rem, the browser will take whatever the font size of this main HTML element is and multiply it by 1.5. Most web browsers will have a default font size on the HTML element of about the equivalent of 16 pixels. So when we say 1.5, let's get out our calculators. 16 pixels times 1.5. In this specific instance, this is really similar to saying font size of 24 pixels. So if I save this and refresh, watch the white text, it doesn't change at all. So you might be asking yourself, why would we go through all that trouble of using rems? Why wouldn't we just say 24 pixels? Well, it's because not everyone in the world has their web browser configured exactly the same. So for example, on my computer and maybe on your computer, this HTML font size is set to 16 pixels. But for someone else who might be nearsighted or farsighted or maybe just wants to avoid eye strain, their web browser might be configured to use a font size of 20 or 25 or even 30 pixels. And as a good web designer and developer, we want to honor the user's font size preferences. And if we use rem for font size and padding and margin, our entire web design and all of the white space and balance will scale accordingly to the user's font size preference. Whereas if we used pixels for everything, our design would kind of be set in stone. And if a user had a larger default font size, the text might feel too big for the layout surrounding it. But we won't need to worry about that because in this course we will use rem. Alright, that's enough on rem for now. Next, let's focus on fine-tuning this font size. So if we compare this to the design file, it looks to me like we will need to increase this value of 1.5 a bit. So the question becomes, how do we eliminate guesswork? How can we find out the exact value that this should be? Well, normally we would just open this design file in a program like Photoshop or Sketch or Illustrator. But to keep things moving right along, I will just say that the designer told me this text should be 30 pixels. So over in our text editor, let's change this from 1.5. And what should we change it to? Well, let's get out our calculator. So if we want a font size of 30 pixels, and most browsers will use a default font size of 16, we just divide 30 by 16, and that gives us a value of 1.875. So let's use 1.875 rem, save that. That looks better. Next, let's go ahead and edit this text to use a really thin font weight. Let's set the font weight to 100. All right, let's compare this to the design file. If we look really closely, I see a super subtle shadow on this white text. So let's try text shadow. Let's go with a really small one, just a 2 pixel offset, 0 blur. And what color should it be? Let's use a black, but a really transparent black. So we only want the black to be 10% visible. Let's save this, see how it looks. That looks good to me. If we compare this with the design file, I think our last bit of business with this white headline is to make it drop to a second line after the word journeys. There are probably 500 different ways to achieve that with HTML and CSS. Let me show you the way that I would do that. I would measure this, and I would say that this has a width of about 480 pixels, as we can see here. So if we go into our CSS and give this element a max width of 480 pixels, we see that that breaks the text onto a second line, just like we wanted it to. And the text is still center aligned within that 480 pixel paragraph. But now we also want that 480 pixel paragraph to be aligned center within the entire block. So to do that, we can use margin. We can say margin left, auto, margin right, auto. And there you have it. Now 480 pixels is the width that perfectly breaks this onto a second line. But if a user has customized their browser to use a larger than default font setting, 480 pixels won't work. So instead of using pixels here, let's convert this to rem. So let's get out our calculator. Let's take 480 and divide it by 16, gives us 30. So let's replace this with 30 rem. Excellent. For the time being, let's change gears. Let's transition from working on the large hero block to working on the button block. So if we look at the design file, we see that there is a button style that is being used here, here, and in the very bottom, in the footer, it's being used here. Let's scroll back up to the top. Let's say that this medium-sized blue button is the default state for the button block. So let's begin with it. So that element back in the browser lives right here. Let's find this in our HTML, in the HTML file. Only a couple lines down from the opening body tag, we see this link that reads Get in Touch. Let's go ahead and give this element a class so we can target it with our CSS. Let's give it a class of btn, short for button. Let's save this file, and then let's create a brand new CSS file just for this button block. So within our app folder and then the assets folder, and then within the styles folder and within the modules folder, let's create a new file. Let's begin the button rule and let's save this file. Let's name this file _btn.css. If we look back at the design file, the first thing we want to do is give the button a blue background and make it use white text. So let's say background color. Let's use a nice blue shade. Color should be white. Now if we save this file and refresh in the browser, we won't see any change to this element, and that is because we need to include or import this button block file into our main style sheet. So within app assets styles, let's open up the main style sheet and let's add a new line where we import in the new button file that we just created. Save that, refresh the browser. There's a bit of progress. And I'm thinking that this blue color that we are using as the background for the button is the exact same blue color we are using for this text. We don't want to have to keep remembering and typing out the hexadecimal code for that blue. So instead, let's create a variable for this blue color that we can reuse in all of our blocks. So let's do this. Let's copy the code for this blue color, and up at the top we can create a variable named main blue, and it should equal that color code. So now we can replace this with main blue. Except there's no sense in keeping this variable definition in this button block file. Instead, let's create a brand new file in the styles base folder that has the single responsibility of holding our variables. So within that styles base folder, let's create a new file. Let's name this new file _variables.css. And let's just go ahead and cut this line where we defined the main blue variable. And let's paste it into the new variables.css file. Let's be sure to go into our main CSS file and import in that new variables file that we just created. So import, go into the base folder, and then grab the variables file. Excellent. So if we save and refresh, nothing changes, just like we were hoping. Now really quickly, let's go back into our large hero block and update the rules for these two headings to use that blue variable. So back in the large hero block, here is the rule for the large title. Let's change the color to main blue. Let's change it for the subtitle element as well. Perfect. Let's get back to styling the button. Let's go ahead and remove the text underline and also give the button a bit of spacing or padding. So in the text editor, within the button file, let's say text decoration none. That will remove the underline. Let's give it a bit of padding. Let's try 1.2 rem. And because we are giving it padding, let's also make sure that we set it to be an inline block level element. That way, its parent and surrounding elements will be aware of its vertical padding. So let's save this. I'm not seeing the change when I refresh. Let's check the command line. So I will actually leave this mistake of mine in the lesson so you can learn from it. I must have hit Command S to save this button file before we had created and saved the new variables file. So the command line is complaining and saying that that variable is undefined, it's unknown. So now that we have the variable file in place, and it definitely does exist, we can just press Ctrl+C to stop the old Webpack task, and then run npm run dev once again. And go back to the button, or actually any CSS file, and save the file to trigger a rebuild or rebundle. And now let's go back to the browser, and there are our changes. So if we compare what we have to the design file, I think that our horizontal padding looks good, but I think we have too much vertical padding. So in our CSS, we can use CSS shorthand. So first we provide a vertical value. So if 1.2 rem was too much, let's try 0.75 rem. This will be used as the top and bottom padding, and this will be used as the left and right padding. That looks better. So at this point, I think our default state for the button block is good to go. Let's work on some of the other instances of the button. So if we scroll down to the very bottom of the design file, we see that in the footer, the button is orange instead of blue. Let's find that footer button in the web browser. So if we scroll down, there's the Get in Touch link. Let's find that in our HTML file. Here we are. Let's scroll down. Here is that link. Let's give it a class of button. So if we save this file and refresh, it receives the button style. Now we just want to make it orange instead of blue. So back in the HTML, let's leave that button class intact, but let's give it a second class that begins with the button block, and we want to use a BEM modifier. To indicate a modifier in BEM, we use 2 dashes and then the name of the modifier. So let's go with button -- orange. Let's jump over to our button CSS file and create that modifier rule. So we will nest it within the main button block rule, ampersands -- orange, background color. Here's the orange color that we will use throughout the design. But you know the drill. We want to save this color as a variable. So let me actually cut this, and let's head over to our variables.css file. Let's create a brand new variable named main orange, and then let's paste in that color code. Okay, let's save this file, and then back in button.css, we can just say background color should be main orange. Let's test this out in the browser. Looks good. Let's scroll back up to the top of the page, and let's work on this button. So we know from the design file that that should be orange, and it should be quite a bit bigger than the buttons in the header and the footer. So let's find this element in our HTML code within the large hero block. Here it is. So let's give it a class of button. Let's give it another class of button -- orange. So just recycling those classes gets us half the way there. Now let's add on another modifier, button -- and let's create a new one named large. Let's jump into our button.css file and create a new modifier rule for large. In this large version, let's do 2 things. Let's bump up the font size and let's give it extra padding. So let's go with a font size of 1.25 rem, or in other words, a font that is 25% larger than the page's default font. And let's bump up the padding a bit. So if the normal button has 0.75 vertical padding, let's try 1.1 rem vertical padding on this large version. And for horizontal padding, let's bump it up from 1.2 rem to maybe 1.9 rem. Looks good. Now in future lessons, we can fine-tune these button styles a bit, maybe add a super subtle text shadow, or even a subtle hint of a gradient on hover. But for the time being, that will bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we will take a quick Webpack timeout. We will learn how to configure Webpack to automatically refresh the browser for us when we save a change to our HTML file. And beyond that, when we save a change to a CSS file, Webpack won't even need to refresh the browser at all. It will just auto-inject the new CSS code into the browser's memory completely on the fly. This should be a lot of fun to set up, and it should also provide us with a nice productivity or speed boost. So let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson.